On a cold October evening in 2019, in a small hospice room in Forks, Washington, a 79-year-old woman named Ruth Hollister opened her eyes for what everyone in the room thought would be the last time. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands were cold. Her family had been gathered around the hospital bed for almost 2 days, waiting for the end. And then Ruth turned her head toward her oldest grandson, a 34-year-old nurse named Caleb, and she said 4 words that he would spend the next 3 years of his life trying to understand. "He was your uncle." Caleb leaned closer. He thought she was confused. He thought she was talking about her brother, who had died in Vietnam. But Ruth's eyes were clear, and she squeezed his hand, and she said it again, slower this time. "The one in the woods, behind the house. He was your uncle, Caleb. I'm sorry. I should have told you a long time ago." Ruth Hollister died the next morning, and the strange, quiet story she left behind would eventually become one of the most unsettling personal investigations into a cryptid sighting cluster ever recorded in the Pacific Northwest. But to understand what Ruth meant on her deathbed, you first have to go back almost 60 years, to a summer afternoon in 1962, and to a 7-year-old boy who walked into the woods behind his family's farmhouse and did not come home. The Hollister family farm sat at the end of a long dirt road on the eastern edge of the Olympic Peninsula, about 12 miles outside the town of Forks, surrounded on 3 sides by dense Sitka spruce and western hemlock forest. It was the kind of land where the tree canopy blocks out most of the sky and the ground stays damp even in August. Ruth and her husband Frank raised dairy cattle there and had 3 children. The oldest was a boy named Daniel, born in 1955. By all accounts, Daniel Hollister was a quiet, curious child who spent most of his free time exploring the edges of the forest behind the house. Ruth's journals describe him as a child who listened more than he spoke. On the afternoon of July 22, 1962, Daniel walked off the back porch, carrying a small wooden toy truck his father had carved for him, told his mother he would be back before dinner, and stepped into the woods. He never came back. Clallam County Sheriff's records describe a massive search. More than 200 volunteers combed the forest around the Hollister property for 11 straight days. Bloodhounds lost the scent less than a quarter mile from the tree line. Helicopters searched the rugged country between the farm and the Hoh River. Not a trace of Daniel Hollister was ever found. No clothing, no footprints, no remains. Not even the small wooden toy truck he had been carrying. The official conclusion was that Daniel had either fallen into a ravine, been taken by a cougar, or drowned in a forest creek during a sudden rainstorm that moved through the area on the second day of the search. The case was eventually closed as a presumed accidental death. Ruth Hollister refused to accept any of those explanations. She never held a funeral. She kept Daniel's bedroom exactly as it was on the day he disappeared, with his small jacket still hanging on a hook behind the door for the next 57 years. That alone is not unusual. Grieving mothers keep shrines to lost children all the time. What makes the Hollister case different is what started happening in the woods behind that farmhouse about 6 years after Daniel vanished. In the fall of 1968, a dairy worker on the Hollister farm named Earl Dempsey told Frank that something had been taking raw milk from the back cooler on the barn porch. He assumed it was a bear or a raccoon, but the cooler latch was being carefully lifted and replaced each time, and the only thing ever missing was 1 or 2 cups of fresh milk poured into a shallow metal pan that sat on the cooler lid. A bear would have torn the cooler apart. A raccoon could not have worked the latch. Earl set up a folding chair in the hayloft and waited with a flashlight and a 12-gauge shotgun. Around 3 in the morning, he heard something large moving on the gravel beyond the edge of the barn's outdoor light. In his later statement, Earl said he saw the upper half of a figure standing maybe 20 feet behind the woodpile. Tall, hunched, covered in long, dark hair, with eyes that reflected the light back like a deer's eyes, but set too high off the ground for any deer I ever saw. The figure turned and walked, not ran, back into the tree line. Earl quit the next morning and never set foot on the Hollister property again. Earl Dempsey's account was the first documented sighting of what locals around Forks would eventually start calling the Hollister Ridge creature. Over the next 4 decades, Clallam County Sheriff's logs recorded at least 43 separate sightings within a 3-mile radius of the Hollister farm. Loggers reported long, low vocalizations at dusk, described in one 1981 report as a sound like a man trying to howl through a closed throat. Hunters found wide, flat footprints in the soft earth near forest creeks, between 15 and 17 inches long. A school bus driver named Marjorie Keene saw a large, stooped figure crossing the dirt road near the Hollister property in 1989 and watched it for almost 10 seconds before it disappeared into the brush. Through all of it, Ruth Hollister said almost nothing publicly. When a local newspaper reporter came to the farm in 1992 to ask about the sightings, Ruth offered him coffee on the porch, answered 2 questions politely, and asked him to leave. Her husband Frank had died in 1984. Her 2 surviving children had moved out of state. Ruth lived alone on the farm for the last 35 years of her life. Caleb Hollister, Ruth's grandson, used to visit her every summer as a child. He remembers her as kind, but distant, a woman who would sit on the back porch every evening at dusk, staring at the tree line, sometimes for an hour at a time without speaking. He remembers the way she would leave a covered metal bowl at the edge of the porch steps before going to bed each night, and the way the bowl would always be empty by morning. He remembers asking her once, when he was maybe 8 years old, what the bowl was for. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, then smiled and said, "For an old friend." He never thought about it again. Not for 26 more years. Not until the night Ruth Hollister opened her eyes in a hospice room in Forks and told him that the creature in the woods behind the house had been his uncle. In the weeks after the funeral, Caleb tried to convince himself his grandmother's last words had been the confused murmurs of a dying woman. He told his mother about what Ruth had said. His own mother went quiet for a long time on the other end of the phone and then said, "Caleb, just let it go." She wasn't herself at the end. But there was something in the way she said it, a carefulness that stuck with him. 2 months after the funeral, Caleb drove back out to the old farmhouse on the Olympic Peninsula to help clean it out before the property was sold. The house was mostly empty by then. Most of the furniture had been donated. But in the attic, inside a cedar chest that had belonged to Ruth's mother, Caleb found something he was not expecting. 37 handwritten journals, bound in cheap brown leather, dated from 1962 to 2019. 57 years of almost daily entries, written in Ruth Hollister's tight, careful handwriting. The first journal began 3 days after Daniel disappeared. The early entries are what you might expect from a grieving mother. Prayers, notes about the search, lists of places she still wanted the sheriff to check, descriptions of dreams in which she saw Daniel walking out of the woods back toward the house. But around the fall of 1968, the same autumn Earl Dempsey saw the figure behind the barn, the tone of the journal changes. The prayers stop. The dreams stop. And a new kind of entry begins appearing, short, practical, and written in what reads almost like code. September 14th, milk and bread tonight. Left at the usual place. September 22nd, he took the coat. I think the coat fit. October 4th, heard him on the porch steps, did not open the door. The entries continue on and off for the next 5 decades. Sometimes weeks would pass between notes. Sometimes Ruth would write every night for a month. The pattern Caleb slowly began to piece together from those journals was staggering. From the fall of 1968 until the week Ruth checked herself into hospice in October of 2019, Ruth Hollister had been leaving food, clothing, and small objects at the tree line behind the farmhouse almost every single night of her life. And something had been taking them. She never wrote the word Daniel. She never wrote the word son. She referred to whatever it was throughout 57 years of journaling only as him. And in one entry, dated March of 1974, 12 years after Daniel disappeared, she wrote something that stopped Caleb cold when he first read it by lamplight in the attic of the farmhouse his family had lived in for 4 generations. He came close enough tonight for me to see his face. I am not going to write about what I saw. I will only say that I am certain now. And I am sorry, Daniel. I am so sorry. Caleb closed the journal. He sat in the attic for a long time without moving. And then he made a decision that would consume the next 3 years of his life. He was going to find out what his grandmother had really been feeding in those woods behind the house for the last 57 years. The morning after he finished reading the journals, Caleb walked out the back door of the Hollister farmhouse and followed the rough path Ruth had worn into the grass over half a century of nightly visits. The path led about 60 feet from the porch to a low, flat stone at the edge of the tree line. Ruth had called this place the usual place in her journals. Caleb crouched next to the stone and looked at the ground around it. And the first thing he noticed was that the grass was pressed down in a wide oval shape behind the stone, as if something heavy had been sitting there many times, over many years. The second thing he noticed was the prints. The ground behind the stone was soft from late autumn rain. Pushed into the mud, half hidden under a layer of hemlock needles, were at least 4 clear footprints. They were wide at the ball of the foot and narrower at the heel, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Caleb measured the largest one with the tape on his phone, 16.5 inches long, almost 7 inches across at the widest point. Caleb was a nurse, not a cryptozoologist. He did not know what to do with what he was looking at. But he knew one thing. He knew he needed someone with experience to see this place before the weather erased it. 2 days later, he made contact with a retired wildlife biologist from Olympia named Dr. Evelyn Pryor, a woman who had spent 26 years studying black bear and cougar populations in the Olympic National Forest, and who had quietly published 3 peer-reviewed papers on unidentified large mammal tracks found in the Pacific Northwest between 1992 and 2011. She drove up to the Hollister farm within a week. Dr. Pryor spent 2 full days at the site. She made plaster casts of 4 separate footprints from 3 different depths of mud, which suggested the prints had been laid down over at least several weeks rather than all at once. The casts, which Caleb still keeps in a plastic storage bin in his garage, show clearly defined dermal ridges on the toe pads, the small skin patterns that are almost impossible to fake with a carved wooden stomper. In her field notes, Dr. Pryor wrote that the prints did not match any known bear, cougar, human, or known ape species she had ever examined. She also wrote, in careful handwriting at the bottom of the page, "I do not know what made these." With Dr. Pryor's guidance, Caleb set up 3 motion-activated trail cameras along the tree line behind the farmhouse. One was hidden inside a hollow stump about 30 feet from the feeding stone. The second was mounted on a cedar tree at chest height, facing the path Ruth had worn into the grass. The third was angled from higher up, aimed at the stone itself. All 3 cameras were set to infrared at night, with silent shutters. Caleb continued his grandmother's habit of leaving food, a covered metal bowl with bread, fruit, and a small container of raw milk, placed on the stone every evening just before sunset, exactly the way Ruth had described it in her journals. For the first 9 nights, the cameras caught nothing. Deer? Twice. A raccoon? Once. A barred owl that triggered the motion sensor at 2 in the morning and stared directly into the lens. On the 10th night, something else happened. The camera mounted on the cedar tree captured a single frame at 3:11 in the morning. Only one frame. The motion sensor triggered, the shutter fired, and then whatever had moved was gone before a second image could be taken. The frame shows a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of the path, maybe 15 feet from the feeding stone. The shape is clearly upright. Its shoulders are broad and sloped. Its arms hang long at its sides. The face is turned slightly away from the camera, and the quality of the infrared image is too grainy to make out features. But you can see one eye, reflected, pale and large, staring almost directly at the lens, as if whatever it was had heard the shutter fire. Caleb sent the image to Dr. Pryor. She studied it for 3 days before replying. In her email, she wrote, "I cannot identify this animal from a single frame, but I can tell you that the shoulder-to-hip ratio is not consistent with any North American bear, and the apparent height, based on the height of the cedar branches in the background, is somewhere between 7 feet 2 inches and 7 feet 6 inches. Please be careful, Caleb." Over the next 14 months, Caleb and Dr. Pryor documented the Hollister Ridge site in ways that no private cryptid investigation had ever attempted on a single location. They recorded 3 separate vocalizations using parabolic microphones placed near the feeding stone at dusk, including one 31-second call that a bioacoustics analyst at a Washington State University later described as not matching any cataloged mammalian vocalization in our reference library. They collected 2 small samples of coarse, dark hair caught on the bark of a hemlock tree about 20 feet from the stone. Laboratory analysis identified the hair as mammalian, primate adjacent, and genetically degraded beyond species identification, which is the same inconclusive result that almost every supposed Bigfoot hair sample in the historical record has produced. And one more thing. Something Caleb almost did not include in his private notes because he was afraid of what it might mean. In the second summer of the investigation, about 11 months after Ruth's death, Caleb was clearing brush near the feeding stone during daylight hours when he noticed a small object half buried in the moss behind the stone. He knelt down and dug it out with his fingers. It was a wooden toy truck, hand-carved, worn smooth on the edges from decades of weather. One of the wheels was missing. The paint was almost entirely gone. But on the bottom of the truck, scratched into the wood in a child's careful handwriting, were 3 letters. D-A-H, Daniel Allen Hollister. Caleb sat in the moss behind the feeding stone for almost an hour, holding the toy his father's older brother had been carrying on the afternoon he walked into the woods in 1962. The same toy that 200 searchers and bloodhounds and helicopters had failed to find in 11 days of combing those same woods. The same toy that had been missing for 58 years, sitting 3 feet from the stone where his grandmother had left food every night of her adult life. He did not tell Dr. Pryor about the truck for 3 weeks. When he finally did, she was silent on the phone for a long time before she said, "Caleb, whatever is out there, it knows that Stone is a safe place. And whatever is out there, it kept something that mattered to the boy who disappeared. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if anyone does." In the 3rd and final summer of the investigation, Caleb brought a thermal imaging unit borrowed from a wildlife research foundation out of Seattle to the Hollister farm. He spent 4 nights in a tree stand about 40 feet from the feeding stone, wearing dark clothing, scanning the tree line from just after sunset until the battery in the thermal unit failed around 4 in the morning. On the 3rd night, at approximately 2:47 in the morning, The thermal unit picked up a signature at the edge of the cedar grove. Upright, roughly 7.5 feet tall, body temperature consistent with a large, warm-blooded mammal. It stood at the edge of the grove for almost 6 minutes without moving. Caleb watched it the entire time through the unit's small display. It watched the stone. It watched the covered metal bowl he had left there at sunset. And then, slowly, it turned its head. And for one long moment, through 600 feet of dark Pacific Northwest forest, it looked directly at the tree stand where Caleb was sitting. Caleb did not move. He did not breathe. The thermal signature held his gaze, if that is even the right word for what passed between them, for what felt like a very long time. And then it turned, stepped backward into the cedars, and was gone. The covered metal bowl was empty the next morning, not spilled, not torn. Emptied. Carefully. The way someone who has been eating from the same bowl for 57 years might eat from it one more time. Caleb pulled the trail cameras down a week later. He ended the investigation. He never set another feeding stone. He sold the Hollister farmhouse the following spring to a young couple from Seattle who planned to use it as a summer home. He did not tell them about the journals. He did not tell them about the path, or the stone, or the wooden toy truck, which now sits in a small glass case on his bookshelf in Olympia. In the final entry of Ruth Hollister's final journal, dated the week before she checked herself into hospice, there is one short paragraph written in the same careful handwriting as every other entry across 57 years. It reads, "I am going now. I hope he understands. I hope he forgives me for not being able to stay. I hope whoever finds this believes what it means." And then, beneath that, one final line. "He was my son. He was your uncle. And he is still out there." Caleb Hollister has never publicly identified the location of the farm. Dr. Evelyn Pryor has never published her findings. The trail cam frame, the plaster casts, the audio recordings, and the wooden toy truck have never been examined by any mainstream scientific institution. Whatever was in the woods behind the Hollister farmhouse for 57 years is, as far as anyone can prove, still there tonight. Whether it was Daniel or something that took Daniel's place, or something that had always been in those woods, and only Ruth Hollister ever dared to feed it, is a question no one alive can answer anymore. The bowl on the back porch of the Hollister farmhouse is empty now, and the woods, as always, are quiet.